Kia tauta rangamāori e o te rangi e tūnei, a papatuanuku e ta koto nei o te taio e awhi nei, ki rangi e tātou, tihei mauri ora. Tēnā koutou, e te whānau o Tākaro. Ko James Shaw ahau, ko te kaiarahi o te rupu kākariki, e te minita climate change. I should get that translated someday. This mic sounds a little bit loud. Is this a bit loud? You're right? You're okay. You're all shaking your head, so it just sounds loud to me. Amazing weather we're having, isn't it? Isn't it weird? Yeah, well, you could have fooled me, mate. So 20 or 30 years ago, when Sir Alan and others were telling us what climate change would look like, this is what they said it would look like, right? That while the average global temperature might increase, 1 degree or, 1.5 degrees, that doesn't sound like a lot. But it means different things in different parts of the globe at different types of year and with different seasons. So you get more good weather. You also get more bad weather. You just get more weather. Lots of it. And in October, I think it was, October or November, there was a report that came out that said that the Tasman Sea is currently 6 degrees warmer than it has been at any other time since we started measuring these things. 6 degrees, right? That is a heck of a lot. And yes, there is a normal weather pattern that's occurring, La Niña, which happens every few years, changes the global weather pattern, changes and warms New Zealand, and we have these long hot summers and crazy droughts and so on. The last one was 2013, if you remember that one, 29 weeks of uninterrupted sunshine, which wiped $1.5 billion off our agricultural exports because everything died. So you have this kind of normal pattern, but what happens is it gets exacerbated. And so, yes, a La Niña warmer period means right now it is unbelievably warm. And it means that with a warmer sea comes stronger storms. So, of course, that storm that rolled through in early January, in that first week of January, sort of 2 or 3 days, sort of centred around New Plymouth, but kind of felt right across the country, starting up the north, working its way down. Massive flooding around Thames, wiping out the Coromandel Road, all of that kind of thing. Yeah, these things kind of happen from time to time, but the frequency and the severity is much greater. And that is why when people say in Thames, we've had flooding before, but we've never seen it as bad as this, or in Edgecombe, or on the Auckland foreshore, on the kind of, the main road that takes you from Remuera, ironically, into town, seeing king tides now regularly washing over the road there. Things that we've seen before in history, plenty of times, but more frequent and more severe. So, lovely weather we're having. And in New Zealand, I think it's funny, we've had this kind of idea that climate change is something that happens in the future somewhere else, to someone else, right? That's sort of been the narrative in New Zealand for a really long time. The idea that it happens in the Arctic to polar bears in the future, when actually, or if we're a little bit more reflective about it, that it happens to the Pacific Islands in the near future. But actually, and it is happening to those places, it is also happening to us here, now. And it's been happening for a while. So, like I say, the severity and the frequency of these events is definitely increasing. And one of the criticisms that people say is, well, you can't attribute any one extreme weather event to climate change, but you can start to attribute the pattern. And of course, it is difficult for us to attribute just what portion of any given event, any given storm or fire or flood or drought is down to climate change when the country literally has one scientist, who is paid to work out attribution between the relationship between climate change and weather events. One person. So, I know that sounds bleak, but I am delighted to be the Minister for Climate Change because we actually have, I think, an extraordinary opportunity in front of us to do something about this here in New Zealand. And I'm going to back into the piece around COP23 and the United Nations Convention in Bonn that Sir Ellen asked me to talk about via what I think the opportunity is. And actually, just while I'm talking about the weather, do you mind if I take my jacket off? Because it really is really hot. I'm trying to read anything into it. It's just really hot. I figured I was in Dunedin, so, you know. Yeah. All right. There we go. You can take yours off as well, David. So, now that's as far as it goes. I might roll up my sleeves in a sec. Where was I? So, because we actually, I think that we've got an extraordinary opportunity here in New Zealand to be one of the countries in the world that works out what to do about this and how to create a society and economy that prospers and flourishes, but within the boundaries of our environmental limits, which we are now running into. And I know that a lot of people in New Zealand, and you will hear this down here in Dunedin, I am sure, who say, yeah, but look, New Zealand is less than 1% of global emissions, right? We're tiny when it comes to the total pool. Why should we put our economy at risk when you've got the United States and China out there and, you know, the EU and all these other really big emitters out there? But, you know, if you added up all of the countries in the world that each individually emit 1% or less of the total, together we add up to 24%. Well, the United States is 15. China's 25. Right? And to me, what that says is that says a number of things, one of which is that when small countries act together, then collectively we can make as much of a difference as the United States or China or the EU or India or any of the big players. The other thing it says to me is that being small does not absolve us of responsibility. It does not. Because if we don't, particularly an OECD country with the 5th highest emissions per person in the OECD, if we don't act, what we're saying to all of those other small emitting countries, and there are about 90 of them, is it's okay. You don't need to do anything. We're going to leave it all to the big guys. And that's a quarter of the global total unaccounted for there. So, A, we have to, right? We have a responsibility, and we take that responsibility very seriously. B, together with all the other small players and some of the medium and a couple of the large players, actually we can make a really significant difference to this problem. Even if not every country in the world is equally committed to that outcome, we can, acting in concert, make a significant dent on this challenge. And C, New Zealand, particularly, I think, has that opportunity to transform our economy over the course of the next 30 years and to create an economy that, like I said, it flourishes and it prospers, but it also kind of illustrates to the rest of the world how they can find a path forward as well. So one of the challenges that we've got coming up is the relationship between, well, agriculture and the emissions trading scheme and kind of other stuff. And, you know, people say to me, well, look, there is no country in the world that yet has agriculture as part of its emissions trading scheme. Why would we do that? If we can work out how to have net zero emission agriculture here, then that is something that the rest of the world will want and demand. At the moment, the vast majority of countries in our kind of part of our kind of type are dealing with the fact that they've got a stack load of, you know, coal-fired power stations, or their transport emissions. Energy and transport are the things that they're really focused on. But it turns out they've also got agricultural sectors. And as they manage to bring down their emissions in energy and transport, then the next sector is agriculture. And that's the bit that, as a proportion, will grow and sort of start to ring alarm bells for them. And if we focus on that now, that is something that we can then say to the rest of the world, well, here's how you do it. Because other countries have got cows too. Lots of them. Lots more than we have, actually. So that to me, represents an extraordinary opportunity. Not just in terms of sharing solutions, but also actually economically, if you're that kind of way-minded. That's intellectual property, actually. That's products and services, and it's innovation. And it's things that people are going to want and need all over the world. So one of the other narratives that I think that we've had in New Zealand generally is that we think of climate change, dealing with climate change, meeting that challenge, is a sunk cost. Right? This is going to be really expensive to deal with, so let's not bother. Right? Overlooking two things. Not dealing with it's going to be even more expensive, as you all in Dunedin know. Right? And also that it's not just a sunk cost, it's an investment. So we think about it in terms of the money we put in, we don't think about it in terms of the return on that investment. Because what we're talking about is an upgrade to our entire economy. And there have been periods in human history where we've had to do this. This isn't a pretty example, but if you think about the war economy of World War II, everything got retooled, brought women into the workforce, changed the industrial base, and actually about 30 or 40 years worth of kind of technology and economic, stuff came out of the back of that. I'm not advocating that, by the way. I'm just saying that there are periods of time when we think, actually, we need to marshal all of our resources around a goal. And when we do, we unlock tremendous potential. So that's how I see the opportunity that's in front of us. And I think as long as we frame it that way, if we think about this as looking for that opportunity, that this is exciting and it's about innovation, that is a whole lot more powerful than thinking about it as an obligation or a cost or a responsibility that's going to disadvantage us versus everybody else. Because if we continue to think that way, then we will never get where we need to get to. We just won't. And it'll constantly be a matter of debate and argument, and people will stay entrenched in their positions. And so that's why I advocate that we treat this with an entirely Pollyanna-ish worldview and say, let's go for it. So I'll divert now into to Bonn, to COP23 and the international side of all of this, because my focus is heavily domestic, and the work that we need to do here in New Zealand to reduce our emissions, actually to change, even just to start to change the direction of travel would be a good start for us. But actually this is obviously a global challenge, and we are actually only a small part of the overall jigsaw puzzle. So what are the things that we're doing that sort of act in concert with other countries? And so in fairly short order, after we got signed into government, I went over to COP23 in Bonn at the end of last year in November. COP21, of course, was the Paris Agreement, which gave the planet a sort of a glimmer of hope that finally we'd agreed that probably we ought to save the planet. Didn't actually save it, just said that probably we ought to. And so the subsequent COP conferences are about saying, okay, well, what would it actually take to do that? And so the focus of the Bonn conference at the end of last year was what they call writing the rule book, writing the Paris rule book. And the idea is that the Paris Agreement takes effect from the year 2020, so it hasn't actually started yet. That's when things happen. And everything in it is supposed to start working from 2020. But if you read the Paris Agreement, it doesn't actually say a lot about how it's supposed to work. And so there is a lot of work that is happening in the run-up between Paris and the year 2020 when it kicks off. And so there are three things. So there's kind of a number of parallel things that happen at COP conferences. One of which is that you spend a lot of time negotiating the very finer points of everything from how do you measure a forest through to can we talk about agriculture, please, through to what do we do with all that coal that's sitting in the ground over there, and so on, and how do we kind of manage a global system that handles that. Another thing that happens is you kind of use the opportunity of the fact that everybody's there to start to build relationships and partnerships around particular themes, and then the third thing that you have an opportunity to do is actually to, for each country to kind of set out its stall, if you like, and to say, well, where are we in this journey? And I'll start with that third one, because while we were on the aeroplane going over there, Jacinda was in, I'm supposed to call her the Prime Minister now. The Prime Minister was in at one of the trade negotiations in Asia. And she used that line about how climate change is our generation's nuclear-free moment. And we all had heard that because it was in the middle of the election campaign, but the international community hadn't heard that. That's APEC. And so she was on the stage at APEC and said that. And so by the time we got to Bonn, word had kind of spread around the globe, and this was seen as a huge breakthrough and a really positive thing for one of the developed countries, one of the OECD countries, to have said, actually, we are going to really lay out a stall and choose to act. Because the news hasn't been great recently. There have been some other OECD countries who have, pulled back. And so, New Zealand was really seen as a harbinger of good news. So it was kind of strange arriving in Bonn and people go, oh, you're from New Zealand, brilliant. Come and talk to this group or that group, and we had doors opening for us and so on. And I hadn't anticipated just how important that symbolism is actually to the rest of the world. And that other countries then started galvanizing around that. And because I had the opportunity to get up and say that we are committed to the goal of being a net zero emissions economy by the year 2050, that then created permission for other countries to do the same, to say, actually, we can be bold here. We can choose to be bold, and there are other countries out there that are planning to do so. Sweden, by the way, 2045. It's always the Scandinavians. So there is an emerging group of countries, and while we were over there, the French, who are really wanting to take on this leadership role, approached us and said, look, we want to get together a group of countries called the Net Zero Coalition, a group of countries that are committing themselves to a goal of net zero emissions. Didn't have a time zone quite in mind, but as long as we get there, and that group of countries can then start to influence others. So we had that opportunity, and we're now a part of that kind of coalition of countries. The rule book stuff is complicated and it's hard, right? And it always has been. That's why it took us 23 years to get to an agreement, even to kind of start. But there were three things that I saw that I take some hope from, so some progress. One of which is, in many ways, I think COP23 was a signal that the coal industry is on its way out globally, right? It'll take a while and not without a fight, but I guess the momentum around countries that were signing up to things like the Powering Past Coal Coalition and a series of other initiatives to phase out the use of coal was actually quite extraordinary. Actually, the Powering Past Coal Coalition, which we're a member of, had a launch event. So this was organised by Canada and the United Kingdom. And we got to this launch event, and security weren't letting any more people in because they were worried that the floor was going to collapse because there were so many people in the room, which was totally unanticipated. So many countries and states and cities and companies said, actually, we want to put that marker in the ground and be a part of that. And they actually had, I think the state of Oregon actually signed it in the room. They hadn't kind of caught up with the opportunity to do so, but the governor of Oregon was there and signed Oregon up to it and so on. So that to me was unanticipated and very welcome. The second is that agriculture has been off the table, not just in New Zealand, but in Bonn as well. And in many ways, you can understand people's concern about that, like this idea, particularly in poorer parts of the world, that action on climate change is going to mean a reduction in food production, which if you consider that we've had a 40% reduction in arable land in the last 30 years around the world, but the population has doubled in the same period of time and will increase to 10 billion by 2050, that actually we need to increase food production by about 50% over the next 30 years. So it's a really touchy subject because people are very worried about that constraint on agricultural food production. But also recognise that actually, finally, recognise that yes, it is a sector that actually contributes to the problem, and one of the reasons why there's less arable land around is because of the emissions profile that agriculture has. So there is now a conversation that's starting to happen around that, and that means that the kind of position that the internal argument that we've been having in this country for the last 1,000 years, is actually being played out on a global scale. You might say that's a bad thing, but actually I think some of our experience with that argument is actually useful to have had, right? Because we've sort of we're almost, not quite, we're not done yet, but we're working our way through that debate here, and we're getting to a point of, I think, of resolution. I guess the third thing that I really noticed in Bonn was the focus on the Pacific and on small island states, which, given their kind of relative lack of power and lack of population and economic, if you're the United States, their inconsequence in that sense, was great. I mean, it was really heartening to see, and that was largely because Fiji had the chair, and so they had brought their own kind of agenda to it, and we were in this conference hall in Bonn, which was decked out in bula shirts and, had kind of canoes and all sorts of things. It was great. Germans were a bit startled. So that sort of focus, I think, helped to sharpen the minds of countries that are not immediately threatened, for example, by rising seas, to actually that this is real. It is happening to a number of places and countries right now. And for us, we actually had two ministers there. Aupito Williams-Seo, who's the Minister for Pacific Communities in New Zealand, came as well. And that was great because it meant that he could actually spend his entire time working with the Pacific Island delegations and their prime ministers and secretaries for climate change, which is unusual and great because my ability to do that as well as all the other bits was kind of limited. So for us, it was a bit of a breakthrough moment in terms of us being able to kind of stand with the Pacific at an event which had a pretty Pacific sort of feel to it and helped to get those issues onto the global stage. So those are three things that came out of that conference. And I know when you're looking at it and you're reading the newspapers, year after year actually, you can think, well, these things are just talk fests and they don't ever seem to go anywhere, and I certainly can understand why you would get that impression. But there are things that are happening as a result of that. And for me personally, because we've got our own significant plans in terms of climate change here, there were some real opportunities to start to move on some of that stuff. So one of the things that our government is doing is setting up a green investment fund. The idea is that it will work to basically try and direct flows of capital towards businesses and projects that reduce New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions and make a return on investment. These have been pretty successfully used in about 15 or 16 other jurisdictions around the world, and they, on average, galvanise about $3 of private finance for every $1 of public finance, and have helped to kind of signal that this is the direction that the economy is going in. So it's good for the businesses that are getting invested in, but it's really about kind of marshalling that resource and saying, well, as long as there's investment happening, we want to make sure that as much of it is moving towards the low-carbon economy as possible. And to be in Bonn, and I got to meet with a number of those other organisations that are already there, who've got many years of experience, and I don't think that you can look past the value of that. So that, for me, was something that tangible that came out of it. So domestically, like I said, that's the big focus. And there's kind of three things that I wanted to touch on, and I'll finish with adaptation because I think that's probably where in Dunedin many of your heads are at. But the first thing, of course, which has been fairly well flagged, is the Zero Carbon Act, which is going to get introduced into Parliament later this year. And my intention is that it will pass in about April of next year, of 2019. And I know that for those of you who've been waiting for 23 or 4 years, that you've kind of like, come on, really, another year and a half? But I think this is one of the most significant pieces of legislation for the next 30 years. So we want to get it right. And we want to create the opportunity for bipartisanship, the idea that actually all of Parliament gets in behind it. And that means that we do it slowly, we do it thoroughly, and we make our absolute best effort to address the concerns of those on the other side. We may not be able to meet them all, right? But we make our absolute best effort to try and do so, to remove any excuse not to vote for it. Because if it does what we hope it does and sets a sort of a sinking carbon budget for the next 30 years, that will be, and I say carbon and greenhouse gas emissions interchangeably, that will set our economy on a particular path for the next 3 decades and beyond. And so you want to get that right. So that we're going to introduce later this year. And we're going to do a big piece of consultation on it in the middle of this year, in about May or June. So please keep your eyes peeled on that, because there will be a number of questions that we want to take to people and say, well, what do you think of this? I know I've got, frankly, fairly strong opinions about those things, but there's a number of things I'm not completely settled on, and I would be interested in hearing if people have got a really contrary view to where, where we've started. I'm kind of interested in hearing that. So that's that. The other is significant changes to the emissions trading scheme to try and make it do what it's supposed to do, which is reduce emissions, because so far it hasn't. And so that will sort of happen in the second half of next year as well. There's just quite a lot of bits of work that we have to do to line that up. And that'll do things like, put a cap on emissions that sinks over time in line with our carbon budgets, incentivises native forestry plantation, not just pine trees, all of those sort of things. And the third thing that we're focusing on this year is setting up a proper adaptation work program for New Zealand. Because the argument in New Zealand has been about mitigation, reducing our emissions. That's kind of been the focus of the debate and most of the work program for a long, long time. And of course we need to do that, because so far we haven't actually started to bring down emissions. So we've got to keep doing that. But also because we are experiencing fires in the Port Hills, which look more like a Sydney brush fire than anything we've seen in New Zealand before, or flooding that, again, we're more akin to seeing in, say, the Philippines than here in New Zealand more frequently. Incredibly long droughts of deeper intensity that are just wiping out farmers' hopes all over the country. And these increasingly severe and frequent storms that are causing millions of dollars of damage to infrastructure and roads and houses and so on all over the place. That because we are doing this, we actually need to say, okay, this is happening to us and we need to get ahead of this. Because it is apparent that we are not prepared. We haven't thought it through. In December, I released a report snappily titled the Climate Change Adaptation Technical Working Group Stocktake Report. Climate Change Adaptation Technical Working Group, or CATWAG for short. So we released the stocktake, and the stocktake is simply an assessment of what is at risk in the country, and it's a lot. 5 airports, several hundred kilometres worth of roads, rail lines, such as we've still got rail lines, something like 50,000 houses around the country. There's a lot that's at risk, and we haven't really mapped that out before. And then the next report comes out in April, which is what are the options? So what do we do about that? And I know that here in Dunedin, you've had some recent experience with starting to think through, what are the actual practical implications of this? What sort of infrastructure do we have that's below the ground? So, the pipes and so on that we've got. And in most of New Zealand, we've not paid a lot of attention to that for the last 30 years, and we're discovering that having not paid a great deal of attention to it, a lot of it isn't in great shape. But again, there's an opportunity, I think, which is having something of an infrastructure deficit, having not invested in maintaining our pipes in virtually everywhere in the country. Knowing what we now know about climate change, knowing that having a really effective 3 waters system relies on the sea level being basically where it is today, that if we had upgraded it, we would have spent a lot of money on fixing something that we would now need to be rebuilding again to deal with the fact that the water table is changing and all of that engineering gets to change. So we've actually got an opportunity here to say, oh, okay, now that we know what the likely effects are, how do we build out or rebuild that infrastructure in ways that is more resilient to the future? So that's a pretty significant piece of work. And one of the things that we've got to do around that is work out how we work together to do that more effectively than we have in the past. Because New Zealand has, we've got local authorities, we've got regional councils, we've got central government, you've got community groups, you've got a university here. You've got a lot of different bits of the jigsaw puzzle, but we're not awesome at working together in this country, right? In fact, in many parts, I don't think we're actually spectacularly bad at it, but that is one of the things that I really want us, I think, in our government to bring together and to say, actually, we know that we've got to solve this problem. What are some really good processes and systems that we can use for working through this and having community-led adaptation plans that kind of stretch out and take account of what we now know and that protect people's livelihoods and get ahead of this problem before it turns into a real challenge. And I think, again, me being Pollyanna-ish, because you've had some kind of almost some early warning signals here, that actually there's an opportunity here, and because you've got amazing resources here, to be able to kind of get ahead of that there's a contribution that I think Dunedin and Otago can make to the rest of the country in thinking this through about how do we do this? How do we do this together? How do we put in plan, a strategy that's going to work for the next 30 years that brings all of this together? I think if you can work out how to do that here, then that is going to be tremendously helpful to other parts of the country that are kind of facing similar challenges, which, frankly, is everywhere, by the way. Don't let anyone tell you that just because they don't have a seashore anywhere near them, that climate change isn't going to affect them. I know sea level rise has had a bit of publicity recently, but, I was just reading before I came down here that the Southern Alps have no snow, like none, first time. And that there are consequences to that too. You get increased rock falls and, so there are implications everywhere. So that's kind of what we've got in mind, and from a central government perspective, and I hope that we have the opportunity to work with you. And I do think that central government has a role here in helping to facilitate. I think that there are some functions that we might be able to take on that we haven't taken on in the past. Some of the science I think we could do centrally rather than asking 70 different local authorities all over the country to try and do the same thing with very little resources. There are things that we can provide as resources, but we are really only at the start of thinking all of that stuff through. And I am interested in hearing from you what that looks like and what you could do with it. I want to sort of close first of all by acknowledging Sir Alan Mark and all of the leadership that you have shown over decades and decades and decades and decades, and thank you. And also to acknowledge I'm so used to calling everyone first names, I'm still getting used to it. Claire Curran, a fellow minister who has helped to sort of galvanise some of the action around here and made sure that I came down here as well. So Claire, thank you for your work in this, and also His Worship David Cole. David's a really strong advocate for stronger and more effective action on climate change from central government, working with local government. And working with Local Government New Zealand, the organisation that Dave is now the chair of. And I just want to acknowledge the work that Local Government New Zealand has done because I think it has become one of the most effective voices in the country, sounding the alarm that actually we've got to start getting ahead of this, pointing out that actually we under-resource our local authorities in New Zealand relative to other countries in the world, and that saying actually you're on your own when it comes to dealing with climate change is kind of a bit of a raw deal. And so I know that our ministers and relevant portfolios are really kind of focused, our minds are focused on probably some quite big calls that we've got to make around how we do this here in New Zealand. Because this is going to be one of those things, I think, where we actually have to do some pretty serious rethinking if we're going to carry this off effectively. So thank you very much for coming out tonight and taking the time. And
I met with the Minister earlier today, and as he and his advisor came into the room, I was horrified to realise that they were the only ones with ties on, and there were about 10 of us. So in order to not make him feel isolated this evening, I wore a tie, which is quite out of character for me, I'd have to say. There you go. And now that I've got it on, I'm not sure I know how to take it off. So, if you go online a bit and Google climate change, you'll find that it has been talked about since at least halfway through the 19th century, let alone the 20th century. It goes back a very long way. But more recently, much of the discussion and argument over the past 20 years, and even currently on the lunatic fringe, has been about the past. You know, did this cause that? Did humans cause that? Didn't it happen 10,000 years ago anyway, and why should we worry? But frankly, the debate about whether it is anthropogenic or even if it is happening is settled. It's settled. The scientific evidence is there. So now we must look forward rather than backwards for two reasons. You can't change the past. In fact, you can't even change the present. The only thing you can change is the future. But the other more important reason is that there are no precedents in the past to work from in confronting what we face as a world now. In traditional communities, hundreds, thousands of years ago, when something untoward happened, something new, some new phenomenon came along, you might go to the elders in the village or the community and ask them, well, what did we do last time? Well, what we confront now, there is no last time. This hasn't happened before. So we need to be not only looking forward, but we need to be looking forward and using evidence-based decision-making, not, oh, look how we dealt with it last time. This is how we normally do things, so we'll do that again. That won't work. However, this does need a bit of historical context. So what I'm going to talk about is where local government, and specifically Dunedin City Council and the Dunedin community, is regarding climate change and how we got there, how climate change impacts the activities, the services and the responsibilities of local government, and as a consequence, what local government might, should, need, do, both adaptation and mitigation. What I learned from COP23 in Bonn last year, because I was very fortunate to attend as well, I was representing local government New Zealand, and then what Dunedin can do and what we would like to do regarding both adaptation and mitigation. So, for some time, maybe 20 years, both central and local government in New Zealand have been conscious of how climate change might affect communities and their councils. It's been a growing understanding, it's been a growing realisation, but it's been going on for a couple of decades. So we've had national policy statements and guidance, albeit fairly limited, and usually in coastal areas, from the Ministry for the Environment, and that guidance has been handed out to councils regarding using it as a basis for planning around particularly coastal areas, as I say. So some of the guidance has been, well, if you're allowing or considering allowing developments close to the coast, you need to take into account that over the next 50, 60, 70 years, the sea might rise by 0.8 of a metre or 1 metre or 1.2 or whatever the guidance is. And that's been happening. As I say, it's been somewhat limited. And mostly councils may take that advice into consideration. Although I'd have to say there's been an increasing expectation over the last few years that councils would take it into consideration when considering proposals for new developments especially. And councils have also been doing their own research and investigation. The Dunedin City Council has commissioned some research material over the years. The Otago Regional Council has done some. We've done some together. We're building up quite a reasonable understanding of what the challenges are. And in 2015, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment brought out a report which identified Dunedin as one of the most at-risk places, and at risk to the widest extent of most places in New Zealand, and that is largely South Dunedin, but not entirely confined to it, where it's very low and where sea level rise will, over time, and is now, pushing up groundwater levels, and it's coming up through the surface. And we already knew that from the July 2015 flooding experience. Now, understandably, people looked for other explanations for the flooding, and there were multiple factors, including exacerbation by infrastructure failure. But one of the big lessons from that flood event was that the effects of climate change won't come along one cause at a time. Effects will compound each other. So you can't just say it's one thing. It's not. We've got rising sea levels, we've got rising groundwater, we've got more intense and frequent rain events, and we can expect more of all of that. And so it's simplistic to say, well, the sea's coming up and it's, we'll deal with it this way. The fact is that when they all come together, you've got a problem, and that's what we had. And that event set the DCC off on a major program of work, which I'll come back to. Suffice to say that in the Dunedin context, South Dunedin is a massive challenge going forward, as much as anything, because so many factors interrelate. And those effects I mentioned and the uncertainty of their time frames, and the fact that we've got old, poor housing, we've got topographical challenges because of historic reclamation. After all, South Dunedin was a swamp. It all goes on, and they all affect one another. And the uncertainty of the timeframes is really challenging, because we know that over time there will be areas of South Dunedin where the groundwater will be above the surface, but we don't know when. So do we say, well, that area there, we know that's going to be flooded, so we'll take all the houses out now and we'll retreat from that? Or do we say, well, actually, if we put some more infrastructure in, we put some bigger drainage in, we put some open swales or whatever, we can hold it for a certain length of time. But how long? And how much is it worth investing now to achieve a certain result, and will that hold it for 20 years, and is that worth it? Those sort of calculations, and they're really complex. But we are dealing with people's lives, with people's assets, with people's homes. So it's actually very, very important that we don't give the wrong signals, we don't make hasty decisions, but we don't wait too long to make decisions either. So this is an ongoing bit of work. And much of that challenge is because the area is already developed. If this were a proposed development, if this were a greenfields development that was being proposed, then it would be much more manageable and avoidable. Naturally, people get scared, though, when it's all there and we've got to work out whether we should continue to protect it, how we do that, what will it cost, etc. Now, other parts of New Zealand have been encountering comparable challenges. Kapiti, Thames, the Kapiti Council put a line of sea level rise along the coast on the LIMS, the Land Information Memorandums. It was a hazard identification mechanism, but it was in an existing area with existing homes. They confronted considerable litigation. Now, that litigation was from the homeowners, who happened to be pretty well heeled and could fund that, and they beat the council at a certain point. Now, these people weren't climate change deniers. They just recognised that the value of their properties was going to potentially be compromised if there was a big line through the property saying below this is a hazard zone. But they had something to lose in the medium term. So councils are in a very difficult position in terms of liability. So in that case, you could argue that the councils had a responsibility to those homeowners not to devalue their properties unnecessarily by terming their properties at hazard risk. And you could say that as the law goes in New Zealand, and this is one of the things we're asking central government to give us some clarity on, you could say that we have some financial liability to those current owners. So, but if we, as a council, if that council had said, look, we've got a liability to these owners, we won't do anything, we'll just shut up about it. 20 years down the track, there's a new owner. And all of a sudden, the water's undermining their house, and they come to council and they say, you knew about this 20 years ago, and you didn't put it on our Land Information Memorandum, you're liable. So we're in a no-win situation. It's not necessarily as clear-cut as that, but it does underscore the need for much more legal clarity around fiscal liability as circumstances change. So there's a lot at stake financially, and adaptation to coastal hazard and erosion is and will cost this country billions of dollars. Who will pay? And it's not just homes, it's infrastructure. There are waste treatment plants, there are roads, there's a lot of infrastructure as well as homes and developments. So this is something that we have to confront, and as the Minister mentioned, it's something that local government and central government need to confront together to clarify some of these things. So all councils and communities have quickly become conscious of the need to develop adaptation measures. Now I know, as the Minister said, that a lot of the debate in New Zealand has been around mitigation and what our responsibilities are around reducing our carbon footprint. And that's true. But from local government's point of view, the focus is on what confronts us is how do we adapt? Because the financial challenges for councils and for the communities we represent are around adaptation. They're the ones that hit us in the face. And we need clarity, as I say, around financial liability in the event of a disaster, or you could regard sea level rise as a kind of slow-moving earthquake. It causes just as much damage. We know it's inevitable in some cases. It's just not happening very fast. And the fact that it's not happening very fast has allowed governments in the past to say, well, actually, local government, you can deal with this. This is not an emergency. This is not a natural disaster. So we have been asking local government as a sector has been asking central government for some time for more leadership, more clarity, more direction on climate change adaptation in particular, and it hasn't been forthcoming. And I'm very pleased to see that with the advent of this government, there's a much greater willingness to sit down with local government and say, how do we deal with this together? So Local Government New Zealand identified climate change as a critical challenge for local government some 2 years back. We've got 3 or 4 things that we say are the most critical challenges facing local government in this country. The first was how we fund infrastructure going forward, all the new and renewed infrastructure the Minister referred to, as well as upgrading water plants, wastewater plants, flood protection, all sorts of stuff that we know we've got ahead of us, and we simply don't have sustainable funding lines to do it. The second was how we deal with all the water issues around the country, whether it's keeping drinking water safe or whether it's who gets irrigation water, those sorts of things, how we keep our rivers clean, all that kind of thing. So water's a massive one. The third one is climate change. They're the 3 big issues facing. And we brought out a local government position on climate change and a declaration in 2017. In 2015 we brought out the declaration. And I'll just read a little bit of that. Climate change presents significant opportunities, challenges and risks to communities throughout the world and in New Zealand. Local and regional government undertakes a wide range of activities that will be impacted by climate change and provides infrastructure and services useful in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and enhancing resilience. And we have come together as a group of mayors and chairs, we signed it, to acknowledge the important and urgent need to address climate change for the benefit of future generations and give our support to the New Zealand government for developing and implementing an ambitious transition plan toward a low-carbon and resilient New Zealand. So that's local government for the last 2 or 3 years has been saying to central government, this is a big issue. It's confronting all of us and we're at the coalface and you're not coming to the party. So we called for both adaptation and mitigation measures and committed to our own actions too. And our council here in Dunedin has taken a few actions. We've divested from fossil fuel investments in exploration and exploitation. We've done a number of things, and we're doing a large amount of work in South Dunedin. So that's the position. We also produced this, and this is was brought out in 2017, How Climate Change Affects Local Government. And it's a catalogue, basically a big long list of all of the things that local government is responsible for in our communities, how climate change impacts on those, and what we might do, whether it's by way of confronting the challenges or taking advantage of them and seeing the opportunities in them. And that's a very long list. Local government is involved in a lot of aspects of people's lives. It doesn't matter where, as the Minister mentioned, we tend to focus on sea level rise and the effect of climate change on coastal communities, but there isn't a single community in this country that will not be affected drastically by climate change over the next 20 years. So I went to COP23 in Bonn, and the interesting thing about COP23, this was a bit of a departure. I'd never been to this meeting before, and frankly, I didn't know what to expect. And the departure this time was that local government had a much bigger role in COP23 than it had before. In fact, it was quite a separate role from the national negotiations that were going on. They even had two zones in Bonn. They had one called the Buller Zone, which was the one where I couldn't get into, where there was heavy-duty security, and that's where all the national conversations were happening. And then they had the Bonn Zone, and that was all sub-national governments. And I was unprepared for the scale of what I found. So this is a building which has multiple exhibition spaces, huge exhibition spaces. It had multiple presentation rooms. It had about 3 restaurants. It had mezzanines. It had toilet blocks. It had cafes. And it was a temporary building. And it would have probably had a footprint about 3 times as big as our stadium. It was absolutely enormous. And there were countries from all over the world. Some of them had national pavilions, and they were displaying what they were doing about climate change or how it was affecting them. There were lectures going on. There were wonderful some talks given to various groups, the best of which were from the current, well, among the best of which, to be fair, were from the current Governor of California, Jerry Brown. Now, some of you may remember, Jerry Brown was the Governor of California in about 1980. Well, he's back again, and belying his 78 or 80 years or whatever he is, he had the energy, he had more energy than I think I could muster, and he gave an absolutely stirring address. And following him was a previous Governor of California, one Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he was equally good. And he had the grace to say, and California is the 8th biggest economy in the world. If you take it on its own, it's the 8th biggest economy in the world. So what they do matters. And they have been dealing with climate change and recognising climate change from the time of Jerry Brown all that time ago. And Arnold Schwarzenegger made reference to the fact that California has a record of dealing with climate change. And he said, one of the reasons that I could be successful in confronting climate change and getting some progress was that I stood on the shoulders of Jerry Brown. And it was a very gracious thing to say, because then he said, and he's not perfect, he's a Democrat. So there's some real and this is an illustration of the fact, and this is one of the learnings from Bonn, that a lot of the activity around the world regarding climate change is being led by subnational governments. In fact, in many cases, the national governments are prevaricating. But city governments, state governments, local councils all over the world, and a lot of them in America, are charging ahead. So America, as I understand it, will probably meet its Paris obligations, but nothing to do with the president, nothing to do with the national government, the Senate and the Congress. It'll be to do with the efforts of states and cities. The other thing I learned in Bonn is that in the climate change space, in terms of working on it, New Zealand was embarrassingly absent, invisible. And I saw countries like Costa Rica, Fiji, countries with considerably less resource than New Zealand has, addressing climate change, putting it, and fair enough, they're in the tropical zone and they're getting hit by its effects a bit earlier than we are, but they were actually getting on with doing something about it. So they're developing carbon audits, they're developing national contribution goals, they're measuring their targets, they're measuring their progress against their targets in terms of mitigation, and we have yet to come up with intermediate targets at all here in New Zealand. And the last thing, among a number of others that I learned from this, the realisation was that the risk for us here in New Zealand in stalling on dealing with particularly agricultural emissions is economic. It's not just environmental. And the reason for that is that as these various countries all identify their contribution goals to reducing their carbon footprint, they are going to be using that. They're going to advertise that. They're going to skite about it, and fair enough. But they're not going to restrict themselves to there. They're going to turn around to the countries that have done nothing, or in New Zealand's case, restricted what we do to certain sectors of our economy, and say, what are you doing? And I don't think that New Zealand's argument that the agricultural sector is just too important to our economy, the dairy industry is too important for our economy for us to sacrifice anything, so we won't do anything about that. And by the way, will you keep buying our milk? It's not going to wash. So I think we've got a window of opportunity to get our crap sorted with regard to how we deal with agricultural emissions, or it's going to bite us in the checkbook. Now, I don't want to be... This is not an attack on the rural sector. This is not saying the dairy farmers are responsible. The whole of New Zealand has benefited from the dairy boom, and we're all part of the solution. We all have to make sacrifices, and we all have to be part of it. It's not restricted to anyone, and that because scapegoating one section of the community and blaming them for all the problems is just a waste of time. So that's just some of the things I learned in Bonn. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to go on. The minister's talked about what's happening at a national level. I just want to quote the stocktake report from the Climate Change Adaptation Technical Working Group, which he mentioned, made a comment that I think is very interesting. The mid-range projected sea level rise over the next 50 years is 30 centimetres. Under this scenario, in Dunedin, this would become a 1 and 2 year event. What had been a 100-year inundation would become a 1 or 2 year event. That is the effect it will have on Dunedin. And we have nearly 2,700 homes that lie less than 50 centimetres above the spring high tide mark, and many of those are below half of that. So we have a real problem. So the encouraging thing for us, though, in reading that guidance that came out, the minister released a couple of things were released, and there's a paper called Preparing for Coastal Change, a summary of coastal hazards, and our staff at the Dunedin City Council have been doing quite a lot of work with the Regional Council, looking at resilience, looking at modelling what might happen in South Dunedin. And a lot of some of this stuff that was released gave some guidance on how to deal with particularly community engagement and developing a consensus going forward on what we should do about it. And we're really pleased to see that the decision cycle that was recommended in that guidance is something that we're already well down the path with. Our council staff work on that, both in terms of modelling water flows and how we might drain and when we might do it, but also in terms of engaging with our community and community groups and building resilience. We're well down the path, and it's a tremendous amount more to do, and we need to be doing it with central government. But we're not going to have to go back and start doing things a different way because we've got different guidance, and we're very pleased about that. But the fact that we've got to do it with central government gives us a real opportunity here in Dunedin, and the minister referred to this. We are, as I said earlier, have been identified as one of the most serious places in New Zealand. We've got to do the work anyway. There's an opportunity for central government's work to use Dunedin as a test case, if you like, learn together about what our situation is, and then apply that to other parts of the country. And the advantage we have is not only that we've got the biggest problem, but we've also got one of the best research institutions in the country, in the University of Otago, and we can utilise that as almost a centre of excellence of climate change research right here in Dunedin, and take an opportunity from the dire situation that South Dunedin is in. So I would suggest that Dunedin is extremely well placed in addressing climate change by virtue of our South Dunedin situation and our tertiary education and research capacity. Just as we need to regard the situation in South Dunedin as an opportunity to improve and upgrade the suburb, we need to regard climate change as an opportunity to take a lead along with central government in addressing climate change challenges. And contrary to those who ask what on earth can a small place like New Zealand or Dunedin do in the scheme of things, Dunedin is in an ideal situation to play a unique and hugely constructive role in creating a better city and a better world. Kia ora.
I'm here with my local electorate hat on, and I want to talk about things local, and I want to talk a bit about pain and opportunity. First of all, can I give a very genuine acknowledgement to you, Sir Alan, bit of a hero, but of course one of many wise people in the room. Can I please also acknowledge Jocelyn Harris over there, who's been a voice in my ear for a long time, to keep these issues prominent and to ensure that all my colleagues keep these issues prominent. Well, they're prominent. When I got elected to Parliament 9 years ago, seems quite a long time now, we give a maiden speech, and I gave a commitment to the people of Dunedin South that they would always be my touchstone and my backbone, and which sort of occasionally, when I say it, it sounds a bit corny, but actually I meant it, which really meant doing my best to listen to advocate for, to endeavour to work with people in my electorate, restore their faith in politics and politicians, and make the communities that make up my electorate strong and resilient. So it's a pledge that I have found myself reflecting on frequently, especially with the challenges facing parts of my electorate, in particular the Greater South Dunedin area. And as those challenges become more present and stark, you know, I could give another whole speech about the Taieri Plains, but and I do want to mention them today because they're that's another area that just happens to sit in the Dunedin South electorate, of which there does need to be a lot of thinking, and I do know that that the City Council is certainly, and the Regional Council certainly are doing that thinking. And I really do want to say kia ora to you, Dave, for for the leadership that you are taking on this issue across our country. We do have particular issues. They do get painful at times, but I think we are starting to make some headway. In this contribution tonight, because I know you're all hot, and I know that you want to ask some questions, but I just want to say a few things, really about context and history and some hopes that I've got for the future. Dunedin is a city of two halves. Southern Dunedin is largely a place where people live or work, and mainly in smaller businesses. There's no central CBD, there's no university, there's no hospital. So for many in southern Dunedin, the low paid and pensioners particularly, life is pretty tough. 60% of people over 15 have an income of $40,000 a year or less. And this, in the 2013 census, the median income in South Dunedin was $20,100, compared with a median of $23,300 for all Dunedin City, which doesn't actually sound very high. In South Dunedin, and just a couple of statistics, in South Dunedin, 7.6% of people aged 15 or over have an annual income of more than $50,000, compared with 22% for Dunedin City. So it gives you a little bit of context for that electorate. It's for that part of Dunedin. Suburbs, South Dunedin is just one of the suburbs that make up that group of suburbs, but it gets all described as South Dunedin. But Tainui, St Kilda, Forbury, St Clair and Kensington, and the population we're talking about is at least 10,000, probably closer closer to 12, even slightly higher than that. 1,400 small businesses. And the population predominantly older, lower income, less likely to own their own home. Quality of much of the housing poor. And if you're thinking about a city the size of Dunedin, that is around about 10% of our population, so it's not insubstantial. Proportion of community facilities low, and of course there's been a lot of discussion about what happens, the poor quality of housing, etc. But over the last 6 years or so, we started to talk more about what's below the ground. And I think it was Professor Blair Fitzharris who wrote that report in 2010, which got everybody talking about that. Then we started to have a series of major events. 2013, the relentless spring tides, heavy seas pounded the seawall in St Clair Esplanade, sucked out the fill from that wall, massive sinkholes emerged. The City Council had to undertake pretty expensive mitigation to put the mound of large stones in front of the wall. And I'm not going to dwell on the floods in 2015 because we know what happened, but massive rainfall event, 142 millimetres over 24 hours, more than 1,200 homes with flooding, perhaps hundreds of small businesses being flooded, bringing trauma to an already vulnerable community. $130 million worth of damage eventually estimated in physical, social, economic damage was the calculation by the insurance industry. Pretty intense, and when that figure came out, there was a debate raging, and which Dave has alluded to around, whether it was infrastructure issues, whether it was rising groundwater, etc., etc. In truth, the issues are complex and multiple. And they're not just about the southern suburbs, they're about the whole of the waterfront. Again, we can't forget the Torrey Plains. And there are other parts of Dunedin as well, but of course they're the major ones. So whether it's coastal erosion, potential breaches in seawalls, coastal dunes, the water table rising in one of Dunedin's most densely populated communities, in fact in one of New Zealand's most densely populated communities, these are major issues. So there have been a series of reports since that 2010 Blair Fitzharris report. The Becker report in 2014, commissioned by the DCC to look at options and costs. And there were estimates put out there then around what it might cost, and that seemed like a lot of money at the time, $10.3 million to protect from a sea level rise of 0.3 metres by 2040, $65 million further costs to develop wells. Then we had the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, which talked about the nearly 3,000 houses that are between 0 and 150, well, it's actually 3,600 and 4,000, between 0 and 150 millimetres above sea level. And that report said that flooding would become more prevalent. We know what all those issues are. I do want to, because coastal erosion and inundation hasn't really been mentioned too much tonight, just very quickly touch more on that. Ocean Beach Domain, 98 hectares and 4 kilometres of coastline between St Clair and Lawyers Head. Long and checkered history of coastal zone management that dates back to the earliest impacts of Pākehā settlement in Dunedin during the 19th century. And after more than a century of management, it's still in much the same. It still remains in a precarious predicament as a coastal buffer. And of course, with the urban build-up, it's become even more precarious. We know that these issues are serious, and what is required has been, and I think everybody here tonight that it's been talking has talked about the need for greater strategic thinking, more joined-up thinking, more long-term planning for physical, social and environmental change. And along with this has got to be funding and policies that adjust to the needs of positive coastal zone management. So it all really boils down to strategic cooperation between all of the players. It involves good and the community. It involves good science and leadership. Someone's got to lead. So brings me to today, which is a joyous occasion to be listening finally to a Minister of the Crown talking about the need for adaptation as a priority and that the Crown has a role to play. And I think you've heard it from the Mayor, you're hearing it from me as the local MP. This has been the missing thing in this equation. Finally, we're hearing it today. The Crown has a vital role to play in bringing stakeholders to the table and its own expertise, particularly scientific expertise. We urgently need more science data collection. And I do want to acknowledge GNS because, and the Otago University, which has brought quite a lot of that to the table, and acknowledge local government for bringing a more coordinated approach to the challenges facing our city. That pain of those events that have happened has brought into relief the opportunities that this is providing, and has also enabled there to be huge step changes and taking place now in how we can work together. We've seen marked improvements in civil defence, better maintenance of infrastructure, planning for future infrastructure improvements. We need a plan. We need it to be part of a bigger plan, and it needs to be able to be applicable elsewhere. This is what the huge opportunity is. I really want to acknowledge the people who live, work and value the southern suburbs of our city that make up Greater South Dunedin, because it's them who's living and breathing the reality of a changing environment and who worry about the value that their predicament is placed by the rest of our community. There's a couple of action groups that have formed out in South Dunedin. There's the South Dunedin Action Group, Greater South Dunedin Action Group. There's also the St Clair Action Group. I'd like to see more joining up of those groups. There's a stakeholder group that's been established, more joining up so that there is a much greater community voice. So my overall take-up messages tonight are that a joined-up, collaborative approach with strong leadership and input from central government is a huge opportunity for New Zealand to show how communities can thrive, adapt and show resilience to the pressures of climate change. Secondly, that we can do this. Following the 2016 Kaikoura earthquake and the subsequent Christchurch fires, which Dave alluded to, hard questions were asked then of our civil defence environment. So there was a ministerial review of that called the Better Responses to Natural Disasters and Other Emergencies, and that was partly driven by opposition pressure. It reported back a week or two ago, and in that review, the authors noted that New Zealanders expect a national emergency management system that can be relied on to work well when needed, that calls for a system that is underpinned by clear roles and responsibilities, good information and communication, the right capability and resources, and that makes the most of local knowledge, balanced with the need for specialist expertise and national capability. Well, look, it's not rocket science for us to know that we need all of those things in this city to approach the climate-related issues confronting us. So I feel a lot more heartened tonight that our community's ability to adapt to the challenges from climate change are in much better hands. And while we know that it's not just about what's happening below the ground in South Dunedin or on our coastline that matters, that poor quality housing, poverty, poor health are pretty damn important too. But if we have a joined-up, collaborative, respectful approach where the community is a valued participant at the table, we'll get much better outcomes, and we'll see Dunedin putting our best foot forward on one of the most important issues facing our city, our country and our planet. And I just want to finally make reference to the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, who told and this is really to say this is not just talk. We've got a passionate Minister of Climate Change who is not only passionate but very bright. We've got a Prime Minister who has put this up as one of the top issues that she wants to focus on. She told the former US Vice President Al Gore in an interview in December that New Zealand has a history of standing up on big issues and that climate change is the one at the moment. That's our opportunity, and now is our time. And Dunedin can be leading and showing how we can do adaptation well. Thanks.
Minister, before we open up for questions, I'd just like, on your behalf, to acknowledge the University's gift of this lecture theatre for tonight's lecture and the technical staff with it at no charge. That's their contribution.